and I enjoyed it. I'll edit this down. I think when I edit it down to worthwhile content, it'll be about 12 minutes long, but
what's sad is this all sounds very much like the music I grew up listening to in church. So,
oh yeah,
it's Catholic music, which is pretty much sad music. It's the same thing, I think.
All right, we'll fade that out, everybody. Hi, welcome finally, 12 minutes after our scheduled time to the live stream version of the Comical Heathen podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jerry Jaffe. We did have a little bit of technical difficulties getting our co-host to phone in, but we are all connected and everything should be working. So let me introduce to you my good friend, comedian from the Cleveland area, John Hensler.
Hey, how are you guys doing? I don't know if you know this, Jerry. You can actually now call me the Reverend Dr. John Hensler because I'm now a member of the Church of the Subgenius, paid in full. So I now have a title. It's not quite as lofty as yours. It's kind of made up, and I had to pay $35 for it. But it's actually way less than what you had to pay for your doctorate. So
yes, which I am in fact still paying for. I don't suppose you had to get a student loan to get your certificate.
Nope, just used my Trump money to do it. Actually,
excellent. That's a good investment. So John hosted my show for me. So with the Comical Heathen podcast, I also have started doing a live show. I did a few performances earlier in pre-pandemic days, and then I was scheduling it. John, I had this scheduled in St. Louis, in New Jersey, Louisville, Toledo, Akron, etc. And all those shows got postponed and canceled. That's appropriate, to be honest. I'm upset, but it's a situation which I can accept. But anyway, the point is that there is a live show version of this. And in the live show, I have a host. And in fact, John Hensler hosted for me at the very first one at the Not Your Parents' Basement show, co-produced by the Cleveland Comedy Festival. John, I know it was a few months ago. Yes. What did you remember about that show?
I remember the crowd being very into it. I remember it's interesting because I feel like a lot of times when you do like atheist or religious humor, it's tough because you don't know what crowd you're getting. And even a lot of people who maybe aren't religious or atheists, they don't want to hear jokes about it. So it was kind of unique to have a crowd full of people who were just kind of like-minded in that sense, where even if they weren't atheists, they were still kind of open to a religious discussion and kind of commentary on religion. So I kind of think that's something hopefully we kind of build more of in the future of, just generally people being open to talking about religion and, just more and more people laughing at that stuff, being willing to laugh, I guess, instead of being so uptight. Because there's so many things that are on the table now, but I think in a lot of ways religion isn't. And like people get kind of uptight and upset when you do talk about someone else's religion to where you can't even criticize it or joke about it. Right. So I think it's a good show to kind of promote that message of this is just another thing for us to talk about. So let's talk about it,
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I was going for, the marketing side of it. Like this is basically a self-produced show, so when I go into a venue, the venues I've used so far have been very supportive and have helped me with marketing, but I still need to have like a marketing plan. And so in other words, I try to make it clear that that's what we're talking about. The last time I did the show was in March, and it was down in Columbus, and we had 20 paid customers in the audience. And I was thrilled, as comedians are, to have any audience. I think that was like kind of like what you and I were just saying. Like people knew, even most of the people didn't even know me. So like in Cleveland, like 90% of the audiences know who I am and what my interests are. But this was just people who came to see the show based on advertising and having a free evening and whatever. 2 people did walk out, and
well,
you'll get that. In fact, the way that theater was set up, they had to walk in front of the stage to leave. And you would think as a comedian that'd be like a great time for a dick move, but in fact it was the opposite. Right. I literally just said, "Thank you for coming. Don't even worry about it. I'm just glad you're here." And
that's a good approach.
Big deal out of it. Well, in the shows, I've been doing a Q&A section. We actually get the people to write down questions at the beginning of the show, and then I have the host, which was you at the first show, like pick the questions without consulting me, and it's kind of almost like an improv game, right? They wrote the questions. So that's kind of what we're trying to recreate here. We got some questions across the interwebs, and you've collected some questions, and most of the questions I know little or nothing about. So I'm just going to sort of college professor it and wing my way through it, and hopefully we hit on some interesting points.
Hey, that's what I did as a college student, so winged my way through it. which is why I don't have a degree. But so
you winged your way.
My first question for you, though.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I had a good time and did learn some things. So
good.
So my first question is, and this has to do with the marketing aspect, because all good religions need a good marketing scheme. I've noticed on Facebook you have been formulating your own kind of religious marketing scheme with your church. Was it the Church and the Invisible Product of the Sky? So I was wondering maybe just if you can kind of expand on that a little bit more and maybe correct me if I got the name wrong and kind of let us know what that's all about.
Sure. So Mike Baker with Marv Connor, who are both Akron-based Northeast Ohio comedians who are both interested in satire, started their own new satire site called the $1 Trillion Dreadful. And they went around inviting some other comedians to contribute. And so, Marv asked me about it. And I said, well, I have an idea. What if I create a column in a character, and the character has this new church? So I guess you would say it's a parody religion. And I called it the Church of the Invisible Product in the Sky. Referring to religion as an invisible product is not an original idea of mine. I mean, many atheists and comedians have already used that phrase, but I just thought I would expand on it. It seemed like a good starting point, like a springboard. I've published 4 or 5 so far. I'll include a link to it in the description of this podcast if anyone wants to follow up. What I try to do is take things that you actually hear either religious or religious extremists saying in real life, and then in the character of Tier 7 High Priest A. Pope, I write a screed which exaggerates what's actually being said. So just to give a quick example, in Ohio just a few months ago, this is current events really, over 100 religious leaders in Ohio sent a letter in to the state to get yoga removed from elementary schools. And apparently this has occurred. I don't know if it's at the state level. The details weren't perfectly clear in the article, but basically yoga has been removed from some elementary schools because of some whiny, complaining religious letter writers.
On the basis of freedom of religion?
Right, the separation of church and state. Yoga has spiritual elements and Eastern Orientalism involved, besides being an exercise, I guess. So, there's an argument to be made from the point of view of separation of church and state that maybe, as you said, put it on the table. Let's discuss it. Is it too religious or is it too, indoctrinating? But it is ironic to have, right-wing, conservative, religious, I hate to use the word nuts because I don't know them personally, but I'll just call them letter-writing complainers, use the separation of church and state argument, right? Because the whole deal is that right-wing conservatives are encroaching on public education.
Right.
So what I did so I wrote a little, screed from the point of view of this character, in which at the beginning he agrees. He says separation of church and state, and you can't have yoga. But then to exaggerate the point of view, I started listing all the other things he wanted removed. Dungeons and Dragons, Star Wars, Yoda, and just other feng shui, other, things that are not, shall we say, that most fans don't endorse because of religiosity, pop culture stuff. And so that was my attempt. I'm not saying that as humor it succeeded, but as a writer, that's what I was trying to do. I took their initial position and then I exaggerated it, trying to show how ridiculous it is. So that's what I do.
Well, it's interesting because I think the thing I was thinking of, well, if you're just teaching the kids yoga, whatever, if you guys are teaching the kids yoga as in this is how you reach nirvana and the spiritual level of it, that's where it kind of becomes. But then you make a good point where you can teach a philosophy off of Star Wars. You can teach a philosophy off of Harry Potter. There's a mindset and a worldview that comes with all of these types of things. So I think a lot of atheists look at teaching religion in school is let's teach comparative religion. Let's not teach yoga is this and it's the way to reach nirvana. Let's teach people, this is how you do yoga. And there are people who believe that this is the way you reach your nirvana or, and this way you give kids a sense of what everybody believes. And the thought is that when they see this, they go, oh, well, none of this is really true, but they understand it on a much deeper level to where they're not afraid of it. They're not criticizing it unjustly. And they have a sense of what it is instead of just this is what you should be taught because this is what our society believes. And
I think that some people misunderstand. I don't know if you ever had this conversation, John, coffee shop type conversation. People will say, how come there's no prayer in school or kids should be allowed to pray? And they are. Literally any child in any public school in America today, well, there are none in public schools today, but when and if there are attendance to public schools, again, any kid can pray anytime they want. If they're about to take a hard test and want to say a silent prayer to themselves, of course they can. So teacher's not going to run across the room and tackle an 8-year-old and say, you can't pray, and throw them out the window. The point is that the school and the state can't advocate a religious perspective.
So I was going to say, I have one more quick question for you about your religion, and then we can kind of head back in, because it's a very important question to me, is what kind of hats do you wear in your religion?
That is actually going to be the subject of my next article. And
call me the king of segues.
Yes. And John, by the way, John did not know that. I did not give him that question. In fact, I think someone asked me that question on a Facebook post recently. So I don't know if you got that off of Facebook, but thank you, Anne. Anne actually asked me about headwear for this religion.
I just think silly hats are essential as much as marketing is essential to religions.
Absolutely.
I think silly hats are equally important.
In post-production, I can edit this out if it bores me, but I'm going to give you like a 2-minute answer, because one of my inspirations, you mentioned you're a reverend in the Church of the Subgenius, is the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Oh,
yes.
Also known as Pastafarians. And Pastafarians are supposed to wear colanders on their head. That's their religious headwear. And, like you strain spaghetti through. There's from people who participate in this, cultural endeavor of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, they try to get official photos taken wearing their headwear. They'll go to the DMV and they'll wear it. The person will say, I can't take your picture with that on. And then they'll say, this is my religious headdress. So if you let Jewish people wear their yarmulkes, or Muslim people wear their, garb, and so people get their driver's license pictures taken with this headwear on and other official photos. So I'm going to be advocating for followers of the Church of the Invisible Product to wear bunny ears, and expect a screed with photos about it in my next episode on the $1 Trillion Dreadful.
Well, I'm glad I asked, because that was kind of a throwaway, one-off, silly question I didn't think you're going to have a real complex answer to, but I'm glad that you did, because, like I said, it just works so wonderfully to show the silliness of it, really.
Yes.
All right. So, are you ready for some of these questions?
Yes, and my dashboard shows when people join in, and I see a Kelly.
Perfect.
And a Jesse. So, hello, Kelly and Jess. Thanks for dropping in, and hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. Okay, we are now entering the actual Q&A portion. John has some questions he's called from you guys. So let's lay it on me, John. What's first?
Okay, so Clint in Ohio asked, who should be added to the 3,000 gods other than yourself, of course?
Sure, who should be added to 3,000 gods? I mean, I don't know where Clint gets his number, but this is a topic.
I think there's more than that.
Yes. So anthropologists and sociologists who study this question, and this is off the top of my head, so I'm going to be using round numbers. You're welcome to fact check me. There are at least 10,000 active religions on the earth right now, and about 1 million documented religions since the beginning of known history. And some of those religions are monotheistic, but many of them are not polytheistic. And it also turns out it's sort of hard to count, because sometimes there are gods which take many forms, like it's one god, but they appear in many forms. And then sometimes there are pantheons, Greek gods, Roman gods, Hindu gods. And then also there are spiritual religions, like the Japanese Shinto and some Native Americans that believe sort of like that nature is full of spirits, the spirit in the tree and the spirit of the river and that kind of thing. So what exactly are we supposed to count as gods? And so by the time you try to count it, it's uncountably large number. Thousands, if not millions of gods have been posited throughout human history. And it's one of the things that if you start to study world religion, it undermines a couple of common premises. Some people think there's the one God, but he takes different forms in different societies. That's sort of a thought that doesn't hold up well to studying world religions, because how can one God be for peace and another God be the God of war, or one God love children and another God sacrifice children? There's just too many contradictions. And then finally, to circle back to Clint's question, it may be that because the universe exists inside of you, you are the only God that matters. So if you want to be a spiritualist who feels in like a pro empowering yourself, with the Verve song, Bittersweet Symphony says, I'm a million different people. I wake up every day. Hey, when you wake up tomorrow, be a God. Be your own God. Why not?
See, that kind of falls into where I'm also, I feel like I'm hoping creating religion is going to be the new posh thing, because I'm creating my own religion. And in my religion, we have a fake sense of a pantheon of God XI, which is how I pluralized the gods in my religion.
Right.
And one of the things we also have are demigods. There are humans among us who have godlike qualities, like Les Claypool, for example, is a demigod to me. Just if you listen to Primus or Clem Laypole Delirium or just anything that Les Claypool has his hands on, it's amazing. And so to me, my religion doesn't have a sense of worship. We have a sense of devotion. And you can put your devotion in various places, but if you have too much devotion in one place, you become worship. I see no problem with putting a significant portion of my devotion towards listening to Les Claypool music. So to me, I put devotion towards Les Claypool as a demigod in my religion.
Right. And I feel the same way about Pete Townsend. I would definitely sleep with Pete Townsend. I'm not sexually attracted to him or men, but my level of devotion to him is such that I would definitely have a role in with Pete Townsend.
Well, Kelly Moore and I always talk about how David Bowie and Iggy Pop had to have had sex at some point. We're just convinced
absolutely.
Of it. And I'm the same way. I'm not gay, but I would watch that. That would be the most beautiful thing to me.
Well, that would be a spiritual experience, transcendent for sure.
Exactly. I would feel the spirit moving through me. So
absolutely.
All right, you ready for another one?
Yeah, let's go to the next question.
Okay. Eric from New York asks, does God exist?
Sure.
I would ask, though, in a sense of, does God exist? And how would you determine that? If you're going to say, yes, God does exist, how could you determine that to be true? And do you need to determine that no, God does not exist in order to not believe in it?
Sure. Eric, thank you for your question. And John, thank you for your question. The question is, if we want to try to take it seriously, is circling around the question of proof. And again, I just want to remind listeners, I'm not really getting these questions ahead of time, so I don't have any lesson plan in front of me. I'm mostly just riffing off the top of my head. And I was thinking about a book I saw in a bookstore recently. I thumbed through it. I haven't read it, but the title really struck me. And the title was something like A Data-Driven Approach to Parenting. And it was written by an economist, a professor from Brown University, Emily Osler, I think. But whoever she is, what she did was she took all the research about parenting that can be turned into statistics to show how you can make data driven. And, she says up front, parenting is not a one shoe fits all type of activity. But if you're looking for guidance, should I breastfeed or should I not breastfeed? And then she goes through the data on what research shows about the benefits of doing it or not doing it, and et cetera. So it's a data-driven approach. And I was just thinking about that with religion and this question of does God exist? If you took a data-driven approach, it would be a very short book because you would end up with the number 0 coming up a lot.
Right.
The only type of evidence which exists from a pro-religious perspective is anecdotal. And anecdotal evidence is not without merit. You heard the story of an apple falling on Newton's head. That if you just hear that story, that's an anecdote. It doesn't really tell us much about gravity. It's what you might call a springboard. So if someone says, they believe in angels and they saw an angel, that's an anecdote. I'm not even prepared to say that's 100% wrong, though I suspect it may be. But I would just say, one listener, Jess, just texted in. Did you see that? Common sense equals data parenting. Well, common sense common sense is not always so common as they say, and it can be misleading. And so that's why the scientific method is meant to set up double blinds against preconceptions or assumptions. And so if we take a data-driven approach to the question of does God exist, we do not end up with very much data that supports the existence of supernatural deities that participate in our lives. So, everyone has their personal, I don't know, sort of like feelings. Your feelings count. My feelings count. But if we're asking like serious philosophical, theological, or scientific, questions, we need more than anecdotes. Anecdotes.
Okay, well, maybe.
What do you think, John?
Well, I was going to say this might be I might be able to ask some of the questions I have set up for you through this, because maybe I think one of the arguments a Christian or an apologetics would make to that is, well, isn't like, if you look at the way the human body is, if you look at the way the planet seems to be made for us. I mean, we need water. The planet is covered with water. There's oxygen everywhere we need to breathe. Right. If the planet was just a little bit further away or closer to the sun, we'd be out of the habitable zone. And if we had just a little bit less matter in our universe wouldn't even exist. So, like, isn't that proof enough for you to believe that God exists?
So-called creationism, or in the 21st century, redubbed intelligent design. And I mean, it's a question. Again, I sometimes, John, in these chats, try to phrase it as a coffee shop conversation, right? So it's the kind of things like if you and me and a couple of friends were hanging out, we'd be in a coffee shop, we'd all have our masks on. And if someone brought this up, I would not try to like belittle a person. I've never actively tried to talk someone out of their religious, beliefs. That's up to them. Life is tough enough. But intelligent design does not hold up well to scientific scrutiny. That's the problem. Speaking of coffee house conversations, I was with some friends years ago, 20 years ago, whatever, group of people, 10 people. And I started talking about something to evolution and about how once geologists figured out that the Earth was actually quite old, millions or billions of years old, it gave Darwin's theory time to work. Like for evolution to work the way Darwin describes it, you need millions, if not billions of years. But just a couple hundred years ago, people thought the Earth was only thousands of years old. So that's where we get deep time, like deep time. So I was rambling about that. Okay, I've set the scene, right? And my friend's girlfriend leans in and interrupts me and says, yeah, but that's not taking into account the Christian God.
Yeah. He's magical, Jerry.
I'm talking about evolution, geology, science, but I wasn't taking it. So I made this pithy comment. I said, do you think a geologist in India is taking into account the Christian God? According to my apologies for the bad impersonation, doing the voice, but according to my calculations, the Himalayan mountains are at least 100 million years old. Oh, but I forgot to take into account the Christian God.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not how science progresses.
And that's the thing I've heard someone say once, like there's no God variable. There's no prediction or mathematical equation or theory that doesn't work unless you account for God in it. Like these theories work without a God concept. So it's like, why would you put it in there? Now you're just creating more questions as to, well, how does this God interact with this? And where does this God come from? And, it adds more questions than it actually answers.
That's called Occam's razor. And the fancy word is parsimony. So ideas and theories should be as parsimonious as possible. And so, in other words, you eliminate extraneous, unnecessary guesses and information and drill down to what you really need. Some things in life are complicated. Physics is complicated. How the brain works, neuroscience is complicated. But even when talking about complicated things, scientists still prefer the simplest explanation of those complicated things. And so once you add God into any answer, you've made it more complicated without necessarily adding value to the simpler explanation. I mean, right off the bat, any third grader in Sunday school will ask you who created God. If God created everything, who created God? So you've actually added a new question. That
was my first. That was such a fundamental question that I had. And I remember the first time that I had it, I was walking into the bathroom at church. And every time I would walk into that bathroom now, and I went to school in that building as well. So every time I walked into that, I would go, if God created us, then who created God? And if there was something that created God, then what created that? And it just goes on forever. And it's funny because I have, like, that didn't make sense to me, and infinite regress still doesn't make sense to me. But I look at it now as like, that's really the only answer. And it really does make sense if you think about it. Like, where did you come from, Jerry? Your parents. But where did your parents come from? Their parents. Where did this tree come from? An acorn. But where did that acorn come from? Another tree. So that's just kind of almost how nature works,
Right. Yes. And every time you ask that question, you can answer it. Like you can say, Jerry, where did you come from? Your parents. You don't have to say your parents and God. Like, and that answer is more complicated. especially because your parents' answer is a satisfactory answer.
Right.
Like that does
no one's going to
explain where
question
it
that and
came
say,
from.
prove it.
One other quick thing about intelligent design while we're on the question is that the things that you often hear mentioned, like the eye or childbirth, we could list 100 other things or a million other things. Those things are not so perfect. Our vision is not great, even in the healthy eyes. And then people have all kinds of anything from blindness to eye cancer to poor vision to migraine headaches. Like your eyes are not well designed. And
not to mention it sees upside down.
It sees upside down. It sees cross. There's blood vessels going over the parts of your eyes that receive information. So it would be like having a filter in front of your camera that just made everything slightly out of focus. And same with childbirth.
There are better eyes in nature.
Pre-modern medicine.
Sorry, good.
Pre-modern medicine, childbirth was a leading cause of death in women and infants. I saw a study of a medieval European graveyard, and a third of the bodies unearthed were either women in their teens or infants under the age of 2. And this just indicates the dangers of childbirth. So I would think a loving and caring God who was very good at designing things would come up with a way for, even if women have to carry babies, even if women have to have childbirth, it's not perfect. It's very dangerous. Not even the blood or the ugliness or I'm a man and I can't look because I'm squeamish. It's just like actual horribly designed way to create new people.
Well, let me again put my God hat on, Jerry, and say, but isn't that because man is fallen? We sinned against God. And so the punishment of that is God destroyed his perfect design in order to punish us for our existence here on the earth. Doesn't that make sense to you?
It makes no sense whatsoever. I will say, in his book on religion, Richard Dawkins raises the point that bringing up the evils of the world might be something to worry about, but it actually is not proof against the existence of a God. It's only proof against the existence of a God who loves you.
Of a good God, correct.
Yes. So again, sometimes some people say the God of the Old Testament is a bit of a bastard, but that doesn't mean he's not God.
He very well may be. Yeah. And that was kind of like the second question I had as far as the fall of man when I was growing up was, because first off, God knew, like when God came into the garden and Adam and Eve hid, and once they came out, he was like, well, why are you wearing fig leaves? And that was confusing to me as a child, because it's like, if I showed up to church naked, that would be a thing. And yet God was somehow upset with Adam and Eve for clothing themselves and showing modesty. Yes. And the whole reason why they got kicked out, the whole concept of the apple or pomegranate or whatever it happened to be, was it was the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So that confused me too. Like, if God wants us to be good, moral people, why wouldn't he just imbue that in his, and why would he be mad at us for actually trying to achieve that knowledge?
Yes, indeed. So ergo, it's been described as a setup from the beginning. Right.
Yeah.
He put Adam and Eve in the garden with the tree, told them, don't you eat from that tree. And John, you know that there were 2 forbidden trees in the Garden of Eden.
Yes. The tree of life was the other. Well, you could eat off the tree of life, but not after you've eaten off the tree of knowledge, because then you would be like God. And that was they didn't want you to be their equal. They wanted you to be their lesser.
Correct. In that story, the tempter of Eve is a snake or a serpent. It's not the devil. So
correct. Well, at least not the Jews, the Christians it is, but I see what you're saying, to the original scripture. I don't say anything about Lucifer.
I'm going to back that up. You can say to Christians it is, but if you're reading an edition of the Bible that says Satan in the form of the serpent, blah, 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 that is not a translation of the original.
Right. It's totally, I guess I should have said it's Christian tradition that. Right. That's Christian tradition. It's not, they believe it, but they have no basis for actually believing.
Some Christians have interpreted the metaphor of the serpent as being the presence of Satan. But in the story, it is only a serpent. And my other favorite thing about the story is, if you look at the things the serpent says, because he has like 3 or 4 lines of dialogue in the scene, everything he says is true.
Yeah.
He does not lie. He simply explains to Eve what's going on with the tree.
Yeah, to me, at least into my college years, I started looking at Satan as maybe the hero in this story. He's the one who said, God doesn't want you to be like him. God wants you to be just a lowly human. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and he's the one who convinced us.
Well, John, what else you got for us?
Okay, so we have one more, I think, from the internet, and let me see if I can find it. I forget I think this is from Ken in Ohio.
Okay.
He asks, if God doesn't exist and there's no afterlife, then why care about this life here on Earth?
Right.
Or why not just go Mad Max style,
Yeah, Mad Max style.
That's how we put it.
Hey, Ken is a friend of mine. He lives in Northeast Ohio. He comes out to comedy sometimes. He comments on my Facebook post sometimes. So I want to give a shout out to Ken. I'm not going to psychoanalyze Ken right now. Say he posts colorful things and he has his perspective and his tinfoil hat. But he sometimes does make comments like this. It's not even clear to me how religious Ken is, and we don't need to know. But the question he raises is one that is sometimes asked by Christian apologists, right? Like, if there wasn't a God, what's stopping me from raping you right now, or murdering, or going out in the street and Mad Maxing it? And
why wouldn't you?
Yeah, why wouldn't you? And we get some responses to that. The first one is, anyone who asks that question, I don't mean Ken, so I'm taking Ken off the table right now. You got to wonder what kind of fantasies they have. I mean, aren't they sort of revealing something about anyone who would ask you that question? Aren't they revealing something about themselves?
What are they really saying? Yeah.
Yes. And then again, without, lingering on any Ken or anyone else in particular, because I can't psychoanalyze anybody in the brief time that we have. The other thing is, it just adds the same thing we were talking about earlier of it actually complicates the question to bring God into moral and ethical decision making, because it's like saying, like right now, as a fact, me and John and Ken, we are not raping or murdering anyone. Like, that's already happening, right?
Right.
So now,
like Christians many times,
a third party wants to say, well, Jerry, is the reason you're not raping and murdering right now because of God? To which I would say, no, because those are unethical, immoral things, and I think about the consequences of my actions. And I don't need a God framework to, adopt and understand, an ethical perspective.
Well, I'll say this because
you go, John, and then I have one more part to my answer. But it's always I always tell my students they have to stop me from talking, because otherwise I'll never stop talking.
Well, go ahead, because then I'll still relay off of what you're going to say. So go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to go in one other angle, which is the data-driven approach. Research has been done on this question. And the question could be loosely framed as, does religion make people behave better? So you could say, like, are religious people better behaved? And of course, some of your religious apologists will go immediately to an extreme example, like Hitler or Stalin. And again, there's a lot of research about investigating religiosity, like in cults. Like Stalin may have been an atheist, but he was clearly a cult leader. So I want to take those few outliers out and just say, a large percentage of Americans and the Western world are atheists, and we do not commit heinous crimes. And there are people who study the statistics on this. For example, over 90% of the incarcerated in America identify with a religion.
Mm-hmm.
Very
few atheists are in jail.
Very few. Similarly, there's a researcher, his name's actually Gregory Paul. I might put a link in this so people want to follow up on him. He did a cross-national correlation in which he looked for indicators of religiosity or theocracy, and then he looked at indicators of social health. And a religious person might guess that the more religious or theocratic a nation was, the higher social health it would have. But in fact, John, it's the opposite.
Let me guess.
Yeah.
That's exactly.
It's exactly, So you just look at things like infant mortality rate, or even abortion rates, or drug usage, addiction rates, and just any crime rates, incarceration rates. And the countries that have higher indicators of religiosity have bigger problems in these areas. So if we were going to take a data-driven approach, we would end up concluding that religion is at least not helping, if not making things worse.
Come to a conclusion as to why you're doing a thing and why you wouldn't do a thing, and you have a sense of, at least something that's objective to you as to, my goal is this, and if I do this and that achieves that goal, if I do this and it goes against that goal, that's a better way of doing something rather than this. I have nothing wrong with gay people, but my God says that I can't like them. Like that's to me, it's like for you to discriminate against you. I know so many good people who are like, I have gay friends. I don't care. I'm just saying they shouldn't be married. And it's like, if you can see the ridiculousness in that, why are you referring to something that you see as being like an incorrect moral and not just go with, the morals that make sense to you,
I have this is off the top of my head, so we'd have to look it up, but I did see a survey once that showed that young adult evangelicals, I don't know, like ages 15 to 25, I don't know the exact age range, are significantly more pro-gay marriage than their parents are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think people are getting less. I think we talked about the last time about how the nuns, so to speak, are the highest growing religion to people who say they're not saying they're atheists, but they're not saying that they're religious either. And I think, as you see, I think that was growing even like in my parents' generation. My parents were very religious, but they weren't as serious about it as some people, So I think it was easier for me to kind of step away from. And I had a gay cousin. And my mom called me out. I was being very homophobic in high school with my friends. And my mom said, well, your cousin Rick is gay. And like that kind of made me, it took it away from just like gay people are these people and we can make fun of them to, there's someone that I sort of kind of know. And so like my mom kind of taught me the opposite of what a lot of people do. So I think you're going to see that a lot more of people who were raised by religious parents, but their parents didn't really take it as seriously, which allows the kids to be a little less serious as adults and teenagers as well.
I want to just like asterisk something you said, just because people are listening. When John mentioned the rise of the nuns, that does mean NONES, and it comes from ticking the box that says none of the above on surveys about religion. So the idea would be if you took a survey and it said, what religion are you? And it listed all like the 10 most famous religions or whatever. And somewhere at the bottom of the list was a box that said none. The number of people who pick none has grown significantly. I think a recent Pew survey, in the 2010s, like that recent, placed it at somewhere around 12%. Again, off the top of my head, but it was pretty high. And it was also growing. Like the decade before, that same number might have been 2 or 3%. So the amount of growth was huge. And as John said, not everybody who picks none is declaring themselves an atheist or an agnostic, or a godless communist. A lot of them are just picking that they don't participate in organized religion anymore, or they might be spiritual but not dogmatic, something like that. But the nuns are the fastest growing religious group in America. Be that as it may, the religion that you're raised in gives you certain cultural biases. Some you might be aware of and some you might not be aware of. And so there's no doubt that there's a kind of a feedback loop between your religious upbringing or beliefs as an adult and certain types of confirmation biases or instances of confirmation bias.
Okay, well, I think I've gotten through all the ones that we got offline. So I'm just going to we hit some of the ones I was going to talk about. So let's go into this way, because you were talking about morality. Where do you get your morality from? And so first, I'm going to put my Christian hat back on real quick. But first, I wanted to, this is a common Penn Jillette answer to that question of why aren't you out murdering and raping people, or why don't you rape and murder all the people you want? And he says, well, in fact, I do rape and murder all the people I want, and that number happens to be 0. I don't know where you're getting that, but I think the approach I try to take with it, and this is what a lot of kind of theists have said to me, is I'm not saying that I necessarily would go out and do this stuff, or that it's God who's prohibiting me. It's that man is just, our natural instinct is just to go out and rape and murder. But it's the fact that God imbued this sense of morality on us that made us not want to do that. Right. So it's not necessarily that it's because I'm afraid of God that I'm doing it. It's because God gave me that morality in order to not even want to.
So, and then to your question, so it's a kind of a what if question. What if your sense of moral restraint or ethical goodness is imbued into you by God? So that brings us to a way to talk about a couple of things that we have also already hinted at. First of all, it brings up the natural question of, if it's a God-given gift that we're moral, then why hasn't God given that gift to everyone? So,
well, they just don't want to accept it.
Nonetheless, one of my favorite Eddie Izzard quotes is, don't you think if there was a God, he would have flicked Hitler's head off? So,
well, maybe he is in the afterlife right now, Jerry. So
well, that didn't
maybe
help,
that's his torture.
That didn't help 6 million Jews. That's all I'm saying. So,
well, they got to go to heaven for free. So
there's no explanation of the Holocaust from a religious person. I'm sorry, from a God-fearing religious person that doesn't include that God allowed it to happen. So we end up with it either creates a contradiction, a logical paradox where God gave it to us, this sense of moral restraint, but didn't give it to everybody. In which case, God, if this God exists, is now personally responsible for every evil deed done by man versus man. The other problem with that answer is, just to reiterate Occam's razor, it's an unnecessary complication. Me and Penn Jillette and you and all of the nuns in the Pew survey go about our daily lives not raping and murdering, and we don't need to add God into the explanation. Like, it adds no value to the ethical discussion from a mathematical perspective. It just adds a God variable into the conversation, but the God variable brings nothing additional help to what we're discussing.
Right. So I guess a good question to piggyback off that is then, like, where do morals come from? Can there be objective morality, or is it purely subjective? And how have you determined your own morality? How have you validated that morality to be true? And why would anybody else follow your morality, or why should they?
So Sam Harris has written a book about this called The Moral Landscape. And Sam Harris is actually a neuroscientist himself. Richard Dawkins, of course, his background is in evolutionary biology. And both of them and others have posited that in general, our sense of moral restraint can be accounted for by the process of evolution. We could imagine ancestors of ours, a million years ago, and ones who were let's just say hypothetically too violent to the point where they were not helping their communities or tribes survive, would be, shall we say, culled by their tribe mate. And so if you do that for 1 million years, it is almost like we've domesticated ourselves. Humans are a domesticated animal. There's natural selection, and then there's artificial selection. And artificial selection is used to explain breeding, like why are there different types of dogs? Because humans have bred them. Well, when you breed domesticated animals, their physical, emotional, psychological characteristics change compared to their wild forebears. For example, wolves can move their ears more readily than dogs can. And apes can move their ears more than humans can. So there is evidence that humans are actually the domesticated version of wild humans. And artificial selection and the process of evolution can account for most of the moral landscape that we see in all likelihood.
That's an interesting concept of humans being domesticated, because that's absolutely not wrong, but I don't think I've ever thought of it that way. I mean, I guess I have in a sense of we're not animals in the sense that, in the wild, but like when you think of domestication, you think like a horse is domesticated, or a dog, or a cat. Yep. But yeah, we are very separate from our nearest evolutionary ancestors. So that's a really interesting way to look at it.
Yep. And then I think there is certainly a compelling answer from evolution about where our, to use Sam Harris's expression, moral landscape comes from. And then I'd also point out, like if you look at the 10 Commandments, there's like, thou shalt not murder. That's fine. And we find that in a lot of religions or even communities around the world. So there seems to be, like it has been suggested, I haven't fact checked this, that the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is somewhat universal through communities. I have an analogy that I use with students sometimes, which is if you go around the world, and I mean, I don't care what country, what continent, Inuits or Aboriginals or anyone around the globe that has dwellings of any kind, even tents or permanent buildings, the doors that they make will be suited for the human body to pass through. So I make that observation because the doors themselves could be very different. The buildings could be different. Ornamentation could be different. Connotations and metaphors could be different. So the cultural elements are not universally described, but there is a biological element to doors, which is an absolute requirement. How about one or two more quick ones, John, and then we'll move towards an ending.
I have one really quick one that I want to end with.
Okay.
Maybe. So I don't know the level of your parents' religiosity, but here's a question that has been kind of floating around some atheist circles. And if one of your parents were on their deathbed and asked you to like sit down, I don't know what the Jewish equivalent would be to like I think they call it like the salvation prayer or like, the Our Father or whatever. If one of your parents asked you to do that as an atheist, would you feel comfortable with that? Would you just do it just as, well, they want me to do it? Like, how would you react to that?
Well, I mean, my mother has passed away. My father is still with us. They were both in my upbringing, like mildly religious. Definitely neither of them would be atheist or agnostic. But for example, as a child, we never went to church. Simply never. My father's Jewish, and we were raised in a very, very low level, like highly assimilated, We had Christmas trees, and my mother wasn't Jewish, but she wasn't and she never once suggested that we go to church or took us to church. And we would occasionally talk about religion, but it would never get that deep. And I only say that to say the scenario that you're painting would be like a very extreme hypothetical one for me.
Right. Yeah, right.
But the way I would answer it is, some of those types of events have a ritualistic aspect to them. And I would gladly participate in any ritual that would make a close friend or family member feel better, as long as I did not have to personally acknowledge the existence of any supernatural beings.
Right.
So like if there was a salvation prayer circle and a parent or loved one wanted me there, I would probably sit in, but I wouldn't say or do anything that actually acknowledged. I would sit quietly while the other people were doing their thing. Similarly, at my mother's funeral, my father brought in a Baptist preacher to do a funeral service. And he was a perfectly nice, gentlemanly guy. And he said some religious things that I would definitely not agree with if we got him on the podcast and he wanted to ask me some questions, or I could ask him some questions. But in terms of setting through the funeral, that, did not offend me. I was there to be supportive and participate in a, public ritual. But so as long as I didn't have to somehow personally acknowledge, participate in a baptism or something like that, I would not mind sitting in on a religious ritual to support a family member or loved one.
I think that seems to be kind of the general consensus of most atheists that I've heard answer that is, what does it hurt me to go through the motions? But I wouldn't ask them to denounce their God on my deathbed. If they came, I wouldn't say, I need you to say you don't believe in God to comfort me. And to your point about the funeral, I've been to, I think maybe 3 funerals since I was an atheist, and I really have to control my scoffing, my out loud scoffing. Try to just kind of limit it to eye rolls, because it's just I know people here believe this and it's comforting to them, but it's just such bullshit to me, So it is. It's a challenge, but it's something you kind of need to do as part of us in this society.
My wife will never listen to this, so I'm going to tell you 2 quick stories about my wife, and then we'll go to your last question. Okay. First, I want to mention my wife loves horror movies. I think the Ring, both the Japanese and the American versions, that might be her 2 favorite movies. Also, Silence of the Lambs, that's probably her all-time favorite movie. Not really horror, but still. But she's from Japan, by the way, people who don't know. And when we moved to America in the 90s, they did a 20th anniversary re-release of The Exorcist, which I had already seen many times, but she had never seen. And she was like, oh, this is the most famous horror movie of all time. She wanted to go. We went to the cinema and we watched it. And again, I was probably 26, 27. I had my eyes closed the whole time. I'm surprised I didn't pee my pants. That movie has psychologically damaged me. She sat through the whole thing with her arms crossed, shaking her head, just going, not scary, not scary.
Oh, no. Gosh.
And when it was over, she said, that movie's not scary at all. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but this is my wife's description of The Exorcist. That is a movie about a very sick little girl whose parents refused to get her help.
My gosh, what a perspective.
Yeah, she's not a Catholic. She's not a Christian. She wasn't raised. So I'm not religious, but I was raised with the Catholic mythology. So I could buy into the story elements.
That scares you. Yeah.
Right. But to her, all the story elements was, why is that family bringing a priest in when their daughter is clearly so ill? And
like the horror is the neglect that they're heaping upon this child. Like this child obviously has mental issues or some sort of and you're just like, oh, I'll get an old priest and a young priest, and
yes. And the cure will be murdering the young priest, like the death of the young.
Right, yeah. Put the devil in that guy and throw him out the window, like. And oh goodness,
there was Exorcist spoiler alert. So Kelly just texted in, spoiler alert. I got to say, Kelly, big digression, everybody. I have a spoiler alert rule in this modern world. For a movie, 2 weekends. For a TV show, 3 days. So if you haven't seen The Exorcist in the past, 2 weeks, then spoiler alerts are off. If you care about how The Exorcist ends, go watch it immediately.
You've had, 50 years, so.
Yes, you're kind of behind the curveball there.
All right, so are you ready for my amazing last question?
Okay, everyone, this is the amazing last question, and then we're going to wrap this baby up.
Okay, so I was going to run down and do the 4 best arguments, so to speak, for God. And I got through a couple of them just through the course of conversation, but one that has always kind of just stumped me. I really, I don't know.
John,
I'll just get into it.
Hey, another listener has joined us. The End is Nigh show is entered the studio. Welcome, End is Nigh show.
Awesome.
Hey, text me or something. I want to know more about your show. But you've come to the end, actually. We've been babbling here for about an hour, doing some questions and having some fun. And this is going to be the last question that we do. So thanks for coming along for the ride. All right, John, over to you and your last question.
I'm going to go into the ontological argument for God real quick, which is an old argument, and it's one of the most confusing to me. So maybe I'm just going to throw it out to you in 2 of its forms real quick and see if you can make sense of it. Definitionally, it says God, and these are simplified versions that kind of just give you a sense of it. God is a being which has every perfection, and this is true by a matter of definition, so we can presuppose it. Existence is a perfection, hence God exists, right? So it's kind of basically saying if God has every perfection and existence is one of those perfections, then through circular logic, God exists. This is the one that really kind of confuses me. And like I said, maybe you can kind of make sense of it. It says, I conceive of a being than which no greater can be conceived. If a being than which no greater can be conceived does not exist, then I can conceive of a greater being than which no greater being can be conceived, namely, a being than which no greater can be conceived that exists. I cannot conceive of a being than which greater can be conceived. Hence, a being than which no greater can be conceived exists. So I guess my question off to you, Jay, on the back of that is, what do you think of that?
So I think philosophy is an engaging and messy topic. I teach an intro to philosophy class at the college where I teach. And one of the first things I say, because it's an intro class, is that if you get into philosophy, you'll find that some philosophers are very verbose. They want to be thorough. They want to be super. The End is Nice said, I'm paraphrasing, he just texted in, I don't know what you just said, but it's his new favorite rap chorus. So both of those, ideas are verbose, seem a little overly complicated. I know what's happening there. I've actually seen both of them. I think the first one might even appear in my lecture notes somewhere. The first one is in the form of what's called a syllogism. But syllogism is a form of logical argument where you have like a main premise, an extended premise, and then a conclusion. And it used to be more popular in classical philosophy. Both of these definitions are I don't know where you got them from specifically, but they are reminiscent of an older brand of philosophy. They do seem a little circular, and they demand for these definitions to work, to demand a certain level of already believing in what you're talking about. So you did describe them as circular. The universe might be the greatest being that exists that we can conceive of.
Sure.
And it exists without adding the extra element of a supernatural being.
Right. And we know what it does. We know it exists. Yeah. You don't have to really prove it to me. So
again, it doesn't, you brought up infinite regress. That's one of the problems with these types of arguments is that if you add in just, well, then who created God? It kind of falls apart quickly as a logical argument. But, one of my favorite philosophers and theologians, and he was not an atheist, I want to say that up front, is Søren Kierkegaard. I think if Kierkegaard was alive in the 21st century, he would be an atheist, but that's just me projecting onto him a little bit. But he definitely wasn't when he was alive. But he made he essentially created our modern idea that belief in God should be based on faith. By exploring the idea of faith, he kind of created modern psychology 50 years before Freud did. So he's a really interesting writer. He basically sort of acknowledged you cannot use logic and you cannot use science. All you have is faith. But then he did add that anyone who is a really, truly committed to their faith, like really, really believes it deep down in their heart, is a 1 in a million person, and the rest of society would think that person was mad.
Yes. That's actually really interesting because I have an argument that I tell people when people say, oh, well, can you prove God doesn't exist? And I say, no, but I can prove that you don't believe in God. And they love that challenge.
Sure.
I simply point out, I ask them, if you get cancer, are you going to pray or are you going to go to the doctors? And of course, they get out of it by saying, well, I would go to the doctors because the doctors, God, leads the doctors to do. And it's like,
God created the doctors.
You're saying, so you're saying God is not powerful enough then to actually heal you, that he needs humans to heal you. So you don't really believe in God the way you do, or else you would just say, oh, I would just pray, and if God wanted to heal me, he would heal me. If he didn't, then I would die, and I would go to heaven, and he would take care of my family that's left here on earth.
Yeah. If you were going to be objective, you're stuck with a problem, and I mean the religious apologist is stuck with a problem of about every 2 years, cancer treatments get better.
Right.
So if you got cancer 2 years ago, you're in a worse position than someone who gets cancer 2 years from now. So why is God making the 2 years ago guy's life worse and the 2 years from now guy's life better? And the end is nigh show did text in a thing after your rant. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he's talking about how some of this is rooted in the premise that time is linear. So we don't have time to go into the history of time. Mm-hmm. All right, John, we have been babbling about some Q&A vaguely related to my Comical Heathen live show. I'll remind everyone that the Comical Heathen live show has basically been temporarily suspended until things improve with the pandemic. I'm in touch with a couple of venues, so we'll get back on the schedule as soon as it's safe to do so, and maybe 2021 will be the year of the Comical Heathen tour. And if anybody listening to this podcast wants to bring the live show to your town, email me. We'll find a venue, and if we get 5 people or 50 people, we'll have fun. So I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to say thanks to John for being my co-host. He's co-hosted the live show. He curated all the questions today and has been helping us, stay on track. So thank you, John, for doing this with me.
Absolutely.
Hey, one more person just entered, someone called Variety Mac. Hey, Variety Mac, we're just ending the show. I'm glad you're interested, and shout out for joining us. I'm actually going to edit this and post it as a regular episode in a few days. So please watch for that. And when it comes out, please share it. If you tell 2 friends and you tell 2 friends, we'll all be using the same shampoo soon. John, any last goodbyes you want to throw out there?
No, I just want to say thank you for having me. It's been a kind of a stressful weekend, and I was kind of just stressed out about doing this on top of everything. But it's been very cathartic. This is just conversation that I really just enjoy having. A lot of people say to atheists, well, if you don't believe in God, why do you care so much? Why do you talk so much? Because it's a fascinating thing to me. Just whether or not there is a God, the concept of God throughout the ages, and why people actually believe in this. To me, it's worth talking about. So I'm glad you're having me on the show to talk about it, because it's definitely one of my favorite topics of conversation.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining in. Hey, everybody, thanks for listening. I'm going to play some of the generic sad music that Podbean provides, but I'll be inserting my actual theme music in the edited version.
Take care, everyone.
There's some sad music for you, John.
I love it. Sometimes I just need in touch with my sadness. That sounds pretty chipper.
Let's see. They have a category called sad.
That seems more appropriate.
Let's play some sad music for a few seconds. Oh, yeah. I'm feeling it now.
That is some sad music.